for a limited time at McDonald's. Get a Big Mac Extra Value Meal for $8. That means 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, and medium fries, and a drink. We may need to change that jingle.
Prices and participation may vary.
Recently, we asked some people about sharing their New York Times accounts.
My name is Dana. I am a subscriber to the New York Times, but my husband isn't. And it would be really nice to be able to share a recipe or an article or compete with him in Wordle or Connections. Thank you.
Dana, we heard you. Introducing the New York Times Family Subscription. One subscription, up to 4 separate logins for anyone in your life. Find out more at nytimes.com/family.
Over the last few days, a lot of ink has been spilled about the legacy of Charlie Kirk. Some have called him a free speech activist, a champion of debate. But over on Fox News, before we even knew that Charlie Kirk had died, he was being lionized for what I'd guess will be his most enduring contribution.
Charlie is the best of America. He is the best of what we have to offer.
This is Fox and Friends host Charlie Hurt. He went live as soon as he heard what had happened.
Right now, I am praying for Charlie and his beautiful family, and I'm praying for our country, too.
Within minutes, he was talking about how telling it was that Charlie Kirk had been shot on a college campus.
I think a lot of it has also to do with the idea that there was so much, especially on college campuses, that you're not allowed to talk about, and that there is so much indoctrination on college campuses today. And Charlie Kirk recognized that. He recognized it very early.
Charlie Kirk dropped out of college himself. College indoctrination was a favorite topic of his. And once Kirk's alleged shooter got caught, some even found ways to blame higher education itself. Right-wing commentator Dinesh D'Souza tweeted that the shooter was every conservative parent's worst nightmare. Then he speculated the shooter had been radicalized by a sly, scheming leftist professor. Arizona Republican Carrie Lake begged parents not to send their kids to college, lest they become shooters too. There's a problem with this analysis.
I would say that, we don't have any evidence of the suspect in this case being radicalized by any college professor.
That's Sarah Brown from the Chronicle of Higher Education.
We have no evidence of that at this point, where the authorities are still trying to figure out a motive. What I can say is that, there is this feeling both in the Trump administration, in state legislatures, particularly Republican state legislatures, there's a feeling that colleges have lost their way and that we need to use the power of the government and hold funding hostage to get them back in line. And a big part of what's driving that is this perception that colleges are driving liberal indoctrination.
Sarah says, sure, the administration is pulling billions in grant funding for colleges, but also conservative students have been activated. Last week, Texas A&M fired a professor after one of her pupils complained about the gender and sexuality content of her literature class. After firing this professor, the university fired the department head and then the dean.
And I think especially if you are a professor who teaches about race, if you are a professor who teaches about gender, the current moment feels suffocating for a lot of those professors. Because technically, according to the letter of the law, the federal government is not supposed to interfere in college curriculum. The state government is not supposed to interfere in college curriculum. But politicians are using pretty much any lever they can find to try to reshape and restrict the kinds of things that especially professors who teach on these very particular topics are teaching.
Yeah, is working as a professor or a teacher in general at college, is it fun right now?
It depends on where you are. There are thousands of colleges and universities around the country. A lot of them right now, this academic year, it's business as usual. However, if you are a professor in a place like Texas, where state lawmakers have tried to restrict the topics and issues that you can talk about in your classroom, if you're in a place like that, I think being a professor is really hard. People in higher education often talk about a chilling effect, where it's really important, they will say, for universities to be able to teach and research free from interference. That is critical for the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of knowledge. And I think for a lot of people in higher ed, it feels like that is being threatened.
Today on the show, how the GOP is beginning to win its war on higher education. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise, or wherever you listen. This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. With the weather getting cooler, if you're like me, you're looking around for a couple of new items for your wardrobe, like a new sweater, some cute new kicks. And Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I went over to Saks.com to check out what they've got on tap, and I gotta say, what I love about clicking around their website is that every piece looks special, one of a kind, as if you'd walk into the office or a party and instantly grab everyone's attention. All the big brands are there, stuff like Alice and Olivia, you know, the young and trendy stuff. I love that I can see the care in every piece Saks has chosen for their fall collections. Each dress or pant or shoe feels a little bit elevated. So if you want shopping to be fun and easy, head over to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day. When I asked Sarah Brown just how many of the nation's higher education institutions have been feeling the Trump administration's wrath, it was actually hard for her to say. That's because very few places have been singled out by name. What we do know is that a few elite colleges have decided it would be easier to cut a deal with the president than fight his demands. As a result, they're reconsidering all kinds of things.
At least 3 of the universities, right, Columbia, Penn, Brown, have in certain contexts embraced the Trump administration's interpretation, which was outlined in a January executive order, that there are only 2 sexes, male and female. This has drawn pushback that universities are essentially discontinuing support for the transgender community. The universities themselves wouldn't necessarily see it that way, but that's one change that we've seen.
Yeah, at Penn, this was very specific because Penn had a transgender swimmer as part of its swim team, and they made concessions like, we are not going to be doing that anymore.
And the way the universities put it is, well, the NCAA, which governs our athletics, has already made this change in response to the Trump administration's executive order. And so we are following the NCAA policy.
And then at Columbia, the concessions were more about, quote unquote, anti-Semitism and overseeing academic work.
Exactly. And I think the changes that Columbia has made alarmed a lot of academics, especially, who felt that Columbia was essentially allowing the Trump administration to dictate, you know, for example, the fact that a particular department, the department that focuses on Middle East studies, is now under more oversight.
When you say oversight, what do you mean? Like, who's overseeing what?
Well, an administrator within the university is the one that is providing more oversight. But overall, Columbia's compliance with these demands from the Trump administration, it's being overseen by an external monitor that the government has signed off on. We've also seen both at these institutions that have made deals, as well as at a number of others that are frankly trying to avoid scrutiny from the Trump administration. We've seen a lot of efforts to add required training, for example, on educating staff and students about anti-Semitism.
This is also interesting because, training, for instance, sounds pretty neutral, but it really just depends on who does the training and who decides who the trainers are,
I would also say that universities already do a lot of training. This is often what happens when universities face scrutiny over a particular issue. The response is do more training. And one thing that's actually really striking is that critics who are saying diversity training is liberal indoctrination and we must get rid of it, a lot of those same people are wanting to require universities to offer training on anti-Semitism.
There are other elite schools where the people in charge of them have resigned in the midst of negotiating with the Trump administration. I'm thinking of places like Northwestern, University of Virginia. In those cases, have things gone any differently than at these places where the universities made concessions to the Trump administration? Like, how's that strategy going?
We actually don't fully know. So we don't really have an update on what's happening at the University of Virginia. The president, Jim Ryan, resigned in June because Trump's Department of Justice, it was reported, essentially demanded it. We also don't really have an update on Northwestern. So they had a lot of their research funding frozen earlier this year. The president has now resigned under pressure, both from the Trump administration and on a much longer timeline from congressional Republicans, actually. And at this point, that frozen funding at Northwestern, as far as we know, has not been restored.
Yeah, and some of these actions are strange and hard to watch. Like at Northwestern, the president who resigned is Jewish, and the allegations against Northwestern were about anti-Semitism. There was just a lot of confusion there for me.
Right. And I think what was interesting about Northwestern as well is that the thing that the president there, President Michael Schill, the thing that Republicans really came after him for was for negotiating a deal with pro-Palestinian protesters about a year and a half ago. And if you are on a college campus and you have protests, this is the typical playbook for how you resolve the situation. You sit down with the students, if you're an administrator, and you say, okay, you've got some demands. Can we come to an agreement so that you will stop your protests and we can move forward productively? We've seen that countless times. And so from President Schill's standpoint at Northwestern, he was doing what he thought he needed to do to resolve the situation peacefully without calling in law enforcement to arrest students who were protesting.
Well, that's interesting to note because, Columbia, which was one of the first targets of the Trump administration, they called in the cops. So I don't know how a university is supposed to respond to protests on their campus if they're going to get punished no matter what they do.
It feels like you can't win.
So I want to turn to Harvard because I think it's one of the United States' most elite institutions. It's gotten a lot of attention because, of course, the Trump administration has gone after them pretty hard. And in the beginning, there was a little bit of there was reporting that it was kind of a misunderstanding. Like maybe the Trump administration initiated this turf battle and money war with Harvard by accident. I think we're way past that, though, at this point. Update me on where Harvard stands with the Trump administration.
Yeah, so at this point, Harvard has won an initial court battle in its lawsuit against the Trump administration.
So far, they're not settling.
Correct. So there are two things happening simultaneously. Harvard is pursuing its lawsuit against the Trump administration. It did win an initial court battle where the judge essentially agreed that the Trump administration had violated both the First Amendment and various federal regulations by pulling a lot of Harvard's federal funding. And then we have a separate thing, which is that Harvard is behind closed doors trying to negotiate some kind of deal with the Trump administration. And that's been going on for weeks. The negotiations have, according to various reports, have seemingly kind of ebbed and flowed. They've stalled out at times. There has been a demand personally from President Trump that Harvard be asked to pay at least $500 million to restore its federal funding and resolve these concerns.
Why? Why would Harvard pay the federal government that money?
The allegations are that Harvard has essentially allowed students and faculty and staff to say anti-Semitic things and to make Jewish students feel unsafe, and that the institution has failed to take action. One thing that's important, and the judge who ruled in Harvard's favor at the district level, one important thing that she pointed out is in all of these missives that the Trump administration sent Harvard, so letters saying, you have abided anti-Semitism, you have violated federal law, you must do this and this and this in order to continue a financial relationship with the government. There was never a specific allegation or specific example of anti-Semitism mentioned in any of these documents.
So it sounds like Harvard is doing two things at once, negotiating and then going to court. Do you have a gut about where this is going to land? Because I assume if the university settles, the lawsuit would go away.
It's a really interesting moment for Harvard. I think Harvard gets, frankly, too much attention in comparison to the rest of higher education. It's just one university that educates relatively a tiny number of students. However, I will say that what happens at Harvard matters for the rest of higher education. It sets the tone. And if Harvard decides that it's just the easiest path forward to restore its federal funding is to settle, I think that is going to have implications for how other higher education institutions respond to the Trump administration. What Harvard does here really matters, even if I can't quite predict how it's all going to shake out.
There's one more university I want to talk about that's sort of become embroiled in a fight with the Trump administration, and this is George Mason University. And I want to talk about them because George Mason is really different from Harvard. It's not as elite. Its president is a Black man. And it's interesting, like, the Trump administration has asked for really specific things from this university. And it just sounds like the president has said, no, I won't be doing that. Which, given that so many other universities have folded, is interesting. Is there a reason why this university is able to behave so differently? Or is it really just a question of like who's leading this institution?
We have talked to the president at George Mason. He has said pretty unequivocally, the Trump administration has said that I need to apologize for promoting diversity policies that the government says violated federal law, and I will not be doing that. And at this point, he has not lost his job. So I would say what's happening at George Mason is a really interesting test case because it feels like if George Mason's president can survive this, maybe this offers a path forward for other university leaders to say, no, we're not going to do this. But again, you have to remember that for a lot of these colleges and universities, federal funding is literally essential. It's not just research funding. For so many colleges, financial aid that students receive is literally keeping the institution afloat. At a lot of colleges, if you lose access to federal financial aid, you close.
So why isn't the president of George Mason scared of that?
George Mason is a really interesting case because the president there is a Black man. It's the first Black leader that this institution has ever had. And he, at this point, seems to have decided that standing on principle is going to be worth it. And at this point, the board, politically appointed board, has decided not to remove him from his job. But I don't think we really know how this is all going to shake out. And frankly, the impacts, if the Trump administration decided to pursue financial penalties at George Mason, the penalties would be substantial. And so that's going to be really interesting to follow. Like, is the president's decision, is it going to pay off? Is the Trump administration just going to back away and move on to a new target? It's possible. We just don't really know at this point.
When we get back, how some students are beginning to fight the administration's battle for them. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
When did making plans get this complicated? It's time to streamline with WhatsApp, the secure messaging app that brings the whole group together. Use polls to settle dinner plans. Send event invites and pin messages so no one forgets Mom's 60th. And never miss a meme or milestone. All protected with end-to-end encryption. It's time for WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone. Learn more at whatsapp.com.
And Doug. Here we have the Limu Emu in its natural habitat, helping people customize their car insurance and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Fascinating. It's accompanied by his natural ally, Doug.
Limu? Is that guy with the binoculars watching us?
Cut the camera. They see us.
Only pay for what you need at libertymutual.com.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Savings vary. Underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and affiliates. Excludes Massachusetts.
Sarah Brown says the president's war on higher education is not just top-down. It also relies on empowering state politicians and even students to call out university leaders they find insufficiently conservative. Just last week, a viral video got educators at Texas A&M fired. I asked Sarah to explain how.
What happened at Texas A&M last week is that a Republican state lawmaker posted a video on social media. And what this video showed was a student and a professor in a children's literature course. And the professor says something along the lines of, we're going to continue discussing our remarks on gender and sexuality from the previous class. And a student interrupts, and this is all caught on video, and says, this doesn't comport with my religious beliefs. She also says something important, which is,
because I'm not entirely sure this is legal to be teaching, because according to our president, there's only two genders, and he said that he would be freezing agencies' funding programs that promote gender ideology. And
these videos go viral. And within a couple of days, the professor is fired and 2 administrators are removed from their roles.
What I find interesting about this video is how clearly engineered the emergency is. And I say that because this video was released at a time when students are heading back to class. This video, my understanding, it was taken during a summer course, so it's been sitting for a second. All of a sudden, it gets out there because of this legislator, and there's, emergency-style action over this professor and their colleagues. And to me, it just rings this bell of like, hold it, what are we doing? And why are we doing it on an expedited basis? It just seems like it's an emergency that was created by a lawmaker and someone who has a political agenda.
I still have a lot of questions about what happened here, and our reporters are on the case as we speak. But There was also audio that was posted by the same Republican state lawmaker that there's been no way to confirm its legitimacy, but it purports to depict the student talking to the president of Texas A&M. And initially, the president says, we have LGBTQ studies at this university, and it's just a couple of courses, and there is an academic and professional reason that we teach these kinds of things at this institution.
We have people who go into professional track courses here, people who are going to be psychiatrists or clinical counselors. Those people don't get to pick who their clients are, what citizens they serve, and they want to understand the issues affecting the people that they're going to treat.
Okay.
So there is a professional reason to teach some of these courses.
So he essentially defends the professor's right to teach about those topics in the classroom.
Tell me what exactly you want changed. I mean, you're trying to pick a fight here. What do you want?
I'm not trying to pick a fight. No, sir, I'm not. I'm trying to...
Tell me what you're looking for. What do you expect us to do? Fire her?
Yes, absolutely, because it goes against...
Okay, well, that's not happening.
And then once things get out publicly, he appears to reverse course. And there are still a lot of people online, conservative critics, who are calling for the Texas A&M president to be fired.
Do you think if this Texas A&M professor had had tenure, they wouldn't have been fired?
I don't necessarily think that, because we had another case in Texas last week where a professor with tenure said some things at a conference about socialism. This professor was talking hypothetically about socialist revolution, saying basically, if you are going to overthrow the government, then you need to be well organized, was essentially the gist of what he was saying. This was interpreted by the university, according to their public statements, as inciting violence, and the professor was fired.
Wow. I wonder a little bit, when you speak to university administrators, if any of them at this point are seeing this threat plainly and making plans to become more independent from the U.S. government.
You're already seeing it. University administrators are already making clear that they need to reimagine their institutions for a future in which the government is not as important to the bottom line.
Are there costs to that?
Well, it's hard to overstate how much the government funds higher education. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And there's not just like another funding source that universities can tap. Sure, some of them have large endowments. A lot of that money is already earmarked for particular purposes. You can't just pull cash from it. And most universities do not have large endowments like that. Like, there is no alternative. But you're already seeing administrators say, we're going to need to reimagine how our institutions are funded. Maybe that means more private funding. Maybe that means reducing the scale of some of what we do. And that has real potential consequences. So a lot of what the government funds is research. And if federal funding for research is scaled back, that could, scientists are if you talk to scientists, they will outline a doomsday scenario in which discoveries and cures for cancer and for Alzheimer's are just not made.
Well, I imagine it could also make higher education more exclusive, more expensive. All these things that I think not that long ago, we said we didn't want. We wanted more people going to college. We wanted more people, getting access to those kinds of higher paying jobs on the other end of a college degree,
I would say I don't think that there is a universal belief anymore, particularly among Republican politicians, but also among politicians of other stripes, that going to college is a universally good thing anymore. And so that is going to have implications for the universities, for the economy, for jobs, we'll just have to see how it all shakes out.
I want to make sure we talk about one more thing before we go, which is that I feel like we're talking about some flashy situations here, big lawsuits from the Trump administration, viral videos, that sort of thing. But there are also systemic changes that are happening that could have an impact on students who are well beyond the relatively elite institutions we're talking about now. Can you just explain how the education department and how it funds institutions, how that's changing and what that might mean for higher ed?
Yeah, so a couple of important things here. Last week, the education department announced that it would be discontinuing grant programs that support what are called minority-serving institutions. This basically means colleges and universities that serve a disproportionate number of students from particular racial and ethnic backgrounds. That's hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking about. And to be clear, they said in their announcement, the education department said in their announcement, that they were actually pulling back $350 million that had been appropriated by Congress already for the fiscal 2025 year and redistributing it to other programs. And they say that they can do that.
I was going to say, is that legal?
We will find out. I'm sure there will be legal challenges. There is another really important thing that's affecting students right now. And it's this campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Trump has not changed federal law, but he has interpreted federal civil rights law to mean that DEI, which the administration has not explicitly defined, but if you look at the directives from the administration, it appears to cover any program or activity that operates based on identity, so LGBTQ spaces and perhaps support programs aimed at Black students or Hispanic students. Trump has determined that DEI is illegal discrimination. And a lot of colleges are falling in line with that interpretation.
What does that look like if I'm a student?
If I'm a student and I identify with the LGBTQ community, I might have lost access to a physical space where I used to gather with my friends. And I really relied on that to find community. I might be president of a student organization, and I might not be getting university funding anymore because my organization is catered toward Black students or catered toward Asian American community. Students are still allowed to gather however they want, but a lot of the infrastructure, the funding for those programs, for those spaces and activities, that's what's being threatened. And if you're a student from a minority group, that could be the difference between you wanting to stay in college and maybe wanting to drop out.
Sarah, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Sarah Brown is a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education. After we got off the line, the White House announced $500 million in education department grants would be directed toward historically Black colleges and universities, as well as tribal universities. It seems like a way to make up for cuts for funding for those minority-serving institutions. Charter schools are also going to see their budgets increase, and more than $130 million will be provided for remaking American history and civics courses, so they better reflect the administration's priorities. If you want more What Next, go sign up for Slate Plus, our membership program. You'll get access to ad-free listening across the Slate podcast universe and extra bonus episodes. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Paige Osburn is the senior supervising producer of What Next and What Next TBD. Mia Lobel is the head of audio here at Slate. Ben Richmond is the senior director of podcast operations. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky, say hey, I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.